Thank you once again, Payal.
Yeah, lovely to be here.
And we will directly start with our first question. So you describe a phenomenon you call pessimism paralysis in the West. What moment or experience first made you realize this disconnect between Western pessimism and global South optimism?
It's a sort of like a slow boil, like, a crab in the water, and it's like a slow boil, and you notice it's happening on all fronts. And part of it is mainstream media that is infusing this sort of bias towards pessimism. Also academia. So you have, and it's sort of all webbed together, right? But I would say like a little pinpoint. So I wear multiple hats. I'm a professor. I also am a founder of a lab. I sit on the board for many private as well as government institutions. And I found this convergence happening across sectors when I would sit on a think tank board that I'm part of. And one of the veterans said, who are we, by the way, to bring the disconnected and unconnected to the connected realm? Aren't we feeding them into the data extraction regime? And I was thinking, wow, this is a really different conversation from a decade ago where it was a well understood that those who are not connected should be connected. It's a digital right? And then also with students, I've seen like I do this poll every time I start a class, and now students actually, majority of 9 out of 10 want to opt out of AI. They want to refuse, they want to resist. In fact, they don't want a seat at the table. They want to blow up the table, right? So you have that from academia because being critical means that you have to refuse, resist, and you have to sort of see AI and any kind of new technology as positioned against human interest. And that is a very Western phenomenon. And then I am a digital anthropologist, which means I study how people make sense of technologies in their everyday life. And I focus a lot on the global South. So when I travel to India, when I go to South Africa, Brazil, they're like super excited about these tools. They're looking at it as finally it can be democratizing. They can create visuals which represent them. They finally have managed to play with the algorithms so they can be visible and heard. They can build storytelling. They can build data sets for them, by them. And so that all converged, and I was like, okay, I've got to write this book because we don't seem to understand each other. And it's really important because the issues we have today are intrinsically global in nature, from, peace and connectivity to, the climate crisis to, democracy in the making. All of this and how can we work together as a species if we're not on the same page, right? So.
In the book, you critique how Western institutions define what counts as good in AI and social innovation. How does this moral framing limit our ability to design solutions that actually work for communities in the global South?
Yeah, so you see this rise of the AI for good movement, which is majority of them is from Silicon Valley, actually, right? And it has a very tech evangelist kind of ethos, which is, oh my God, I've created Frankenstein, but don't worry, I can fix it, And so it's like the good of the past becomes evil, but don't you worry, again, I can, do something to make the bad good again. And it's such a reductive sort of trope. And part of it is the sort of altruistic angle enables a lot of the tech companies and these tech altruists who have these egos of wanting to see their mortality, like immortality, right, in the making. And they come up with altruistic projects, which actually is a sort of a double-edged sword, because not only is it altruistic where they feel good about themselves, but they can use that as a way to, harness extraordinary amounts of data from the global South. And when they declare bankruptcy or they declare that the nonprofit has dissolved, where does that data go? And we see this time and time again, right? What happened with WorldCoin, right? Which was basically Sam Altman, the co-founder of OpenAI's nonprofit, or let everyone have money. If anyone, like, imagine if we went to venture capitalists and say, you know what, I have a great idea. We're going to create this technology where everybody's going to have money and we're all going to be fine. It's like so ridiculous, but you just have to know the spin. You have to get the, spiel, and then surprise, surprise, it didn't work. And then what happened to all that data where they were collecting iris scans and fingerprints, etc., in exchange for crypto, right? And then all that data, and then you have the launch of OpenAI. And it's not a conspiracy. It's just a systematic way in which you can, get data because you circumvent the loopholes in the name of doing good. So doing good is not the problem per se. It's just got a bad rap because in the name of doing good, a lot of bad has taken place, and it also creates a falsity that these are beneficiaries, but actually there's a market. This is a market. They're users and they are consumers and they need fair value. And so it's not charity, right? And so I think I have this real aversion now to the whole AI for good movement, because in practice it has actually led to pretty bad and immoral consequences,
Mm-hmm. And your discussion of AI-driven anti-poaching tools shows how technological solutions often fail because they're designed far from the realities on the ground. Using that example, can you please explain how a relational approach might lead to entirely different interventions than the current approach?
Yeah, so basically, look, like for example, the conservation field, right? You have rhinos and other kind of species that are going extinct in Africa, and how do we prevent poachers from getting them, considering that it is a multi-billion euro industry and it's more lucrative than the drug cartel business because it's low stakes, far less regulations. Nobody's really watching them the way they are watching drug cartels, right? So all this to do with, well, how do we deal with it? Well, they send out these like AI-enabled drones to, capture when poachers are coming in so they can actually alert the rangers, to basically move fast. It sounds really, okay, cool, right? Because it sounds like a techno fix. But my relational approach is, well, why doesn't it work? Because it's not working. Well, a couple of things. In relation to context, what's happening? The rangers haven't been paid for months. They don't have proper shoes. They don't have the incentives and motivation. Also, even if they really care, right, which they do in a sense, but it's hard to care if your company is treating you like crap, right, for a couple of months. But say they're on board. Even then, they don't have the vehicles to go at the same speed. It's vast spaces, right? And so they have very outdated vehicles. Not to forget, they're not armed and they're not trained, and they have to face a militia, basically, that are poachers with actual guns. It's a proper warfare. They're not like taking a little baton or a finger wagging bad person. You shouldn't be doing that, right? And so, okay, say they're armed and they're there. Then what? Are they the military? They're not military, but they're facing the military. So is it worth their life? No, it's not. And then it gets even more complicated because oftentimes they happen to be relatives, cousins, or they even know these people who are the poachers because they live in the same village. And it's just common business practice because you know what? It's a job. And so we've demonized these poachers, but in the end of the day, we're like, okay, you can't, here is ivory, which is you're gonna make you really wealthy, and then here's unemployment for, I don't know, a long, long time. So what gives? What do you do? So I think part of the relational aspect is, can we come up with legitimate alternative jobs which actually have progress? Can they like see themselves, because people generally want to do the right thing. They want to have a future for their kids. They don't want to do illegal shit if they don't have to. Generally speaking, we lean towards that, and I do believe that. But if we set the conditions context in a way in which it's so disincentivizing, then why do we get surprised that the technology doesn't work? And the problem is that we reduce it to an information deficit. It's not an information deficit. Oftentimes they know what's going to happen, because they speak to each other. They know what's going on. And even not, but knowing the information doesn't make you want to act. So it's all connected. Let's put context, community, and culture at the center if we really want, to understand why does a certain kind of intervention work and why doesn't others not, right?
You show how young people from poverty or marginal spaces use digital platforms to make themselves visible in ways never available offline, a reality that contrasts with Western narrative that focus mainly on the harms of these platforms. How do you see this difference shaping our understanding of what digital visibility means today?
Yeah, so there's this is a very again Western trope. We constantly like, oh my God, these young people are being harvested for the data, and then they're exposed to all these harms, risks, cyberbullying to all. I mean, it just goes on, right? And nobody's negating that. But the fact is that a lot of young people still find these spaces really important, and really relevant for themselves. So why? Is it because they're stupid? Are they naive? Well, no, these basic explanations don't work. So let's put some hard facts to it. 90% of young people live in the global south. And oftentimes they don't want to be, what the state has thought they should be, which is like a farmer or a construction worker or whatnot, right? They're oftentimes in the lower socioeconomic paradigm. And they don't want to be what their father, grandfather did. They don't want to be farmers. They don't want to be, sanitation workers. They see themselves as carving their own future. So this is a sort of a low barrier of entry for them to reinvent themselves as content creators, as people who have voice, who can share their stories. And they have a little more control over the algorithm than the market. So it's again relational, right? So if they experiment with their, with their community, they can actually really become visible and heard. And we see that whether it's on TikTok. I mean, it was the fastest growing app amongst low socioeconomic populations in the global south because it was so intuitive. You didn't need to know English. Look at it. A lot is stacked against them, right? They don't have the privileged languages which can help you circulate. They don't have all this bling bling, but what they do have is enormous amounts of creativity, and they play the whole, global paradigm card. They are able to do memes, very audiovisual, and they get people's interest, and that's really exciting for them. So, yes, it puts them also in harm's way because more visible, especially if you're women or you intersected with certain caste, religion, ethnicity, etc. You do come in harm's way for sure. But why do people take these risks? We have to understand that and we can't have a paternalistic approach to it, saying, are they ignorant, are they naive? No, because in the end, it still has value. So what we need to focus on is how do we reduce these kind of risks by making these platforms much more enabling and allowing for more freedom of expression and, targeting bad actors. So the punishment should be on the bad actors and not on the people who want to express themselves, right? So I think that's really the way I would approach that.
And you mentioned that many policymakers and development actors are uncomfortable with topics of sexuality, even though digital desire drives large portions of online behavior. What barriers does this moral discomfort create in building realistic digital policy framework?
Yeah, because across the world, we have pathologized intimacy, sex, and sexuality. We are a very conservative species, So, but it's ripe for religion, right? I mean, every religion loves that. That's a favorite topic. So I look at it as we've got on the bandwagon as policymakers, as academics and all. It's like we always like, oh my God, like be careful because you could become a subject of deepfake porn, or you could become, it's so protective. And all of that, again, is legitimate, but also what's more legitimate is these are teenagers, particularly who have teenage desires, feelings. What are the typical questions are like, am I a freak? Am I normal? Any teenager asks that, and they're struggling and nobody's talking to them. Majority of countries are paternalistic, conservative, have deep religious norms, and I myself, I come from India and nobody told me about sex, sexuality, menstruation, nothing. I had to learn from how did I learn? Porn magazine at that time, right? And because some bad girl was circulating it in the convent school in India. And I remember saying, oh my God, she's so cheap, as we had that description, but then we still consume it. You're like, okay, let's see. And then you have these myths about, oh my God, I'm going to get pregnant because I kissed a boy. But then you still kiss the boy, And so imagine the stress and tensions, and this is pre-social media. Now, we see that we also have the data to back it, right? The more conservative you get, the more they consume porn. So it's like, well, either you let porn become the main teacher for sex or sexuality, or grow up and start taking it on as parents, as educators, as policymakers, as governments. But no, it's the reverse. It's banning and forbidding and abstinence, and these are what we're proposing. And then, of course, think about if you're homosexual, about 65 countries criminalize it, some to the point of death. So imagine if that's their very identity. Who do you talk to? It's really high risk to talk to somebody in your community, or your friends. What if it gets leaked? So which is safer, to share that on some strange anonymous group online, with that risk, or in person, in your village or community? And so again, relational approach to understanding why people do what they do, and not, coming up with these sweeping strokes of ignorance. Well, we need to give them more literacies. They lack the literacy. That's why they're doing this. That's why they're visible, or they need attention. We have these extremely condescending tropes to understand why young people are online and stay online.
You introduced the idea of surveillance of care, that monitoring technologies are framed as protection rather than control. How did you arrive at this concept, and why is it especially important for understanding AI use in the global south?
The word surveillance, just like the word capitalism, markets, name it, it's become unfashionable. It's become a dirty word, actually. Like, right? So you say surveillance and people are like, oh my God, that's horrible. Imagine if I have a war t-shirt, I love surveillance. It really drive people nuts. But I adopt this from the medical industry, right? Like medical field, which is about surveillance of care of how do we prevent infectious diseases from, spreading. So let's preempt it, and let's gather information, crowdsource, to see patterns, meaningful patterns, so we can take care of each other. And COVID was a surveillance of care in many respects of how we could do it. Whether we did it well or not is a different question. But people don't talk about that in the negative way. But when we speak about surveillance in common society, in layman's terms, is usually in a very negative light. And the way in which I look at it is that you see a lot of, say, women in Mexico sharing their details to be tracked by their friends and families, because the femicide is extraordinarily high there, and it's really unsafe in certain contexts to travel alone or even with groups, right? And so, yes, you can say, oh, but what about your, privacy? But privacy and safety are always in relationship with one another, and security. So they want to be tracked. They want to be understood, which also shows why, a lot of these ride-hailing platforms have that as an option, particularly for women, being driven in the night, because it's important, right? Or SOS buttons, or for example, you have sanitation workers and salon service workers going into, oftentimes women, going into total strangers' homes to, say, take care of their house or to give them a massage, who protects them unless we actually create a surveillance of care where they can report back if somebody is inappropriate, right? And so there's a system of accountability. So there's being watched and there's being watched over, right? In a sort of nurturing way. So it depends on, the intent, right? Or the way in which we design urban infrastructures, right? We want people to follow the rules. Rules are not necessarily bad, and creating accountability is also part of the surveillance. So I think, we've got the sort of gut level reaction today in these days where we just lapse into what, mainstream media has demarcated as negative. So if it's surveillance, it's negative. If you're optimistic, you're naive and stupid. You're very critical and brilliant if, you are pessimistic because you finally understand the complexities and the anguishness, of why people are so in despair. So,
Mhm. And you highlight that indigenous cultures have long practiced forms of sustainability that Western design is only now beginning to embrace. What possibilities emerge when Western frameworks engage more directly with these indigenous approaches?
yeah, so, the indigenous approach is really interesting because the idea is that we at the Inclusive AI Lab, we work a lot with different indigenous communities. We have multiple members, one from Ecuador, who's indigenous Ecuadorian, and the other is also indigenous Kenyan. And I see the way in which they approach these matters because there's a lot to be learned from them because, for example, redistribution of value. This is fundamentally what we're talking about in the age of AI. What do we do when technologies are harvesting public data, right? And it's not that we haven't benefited from ChatGPT and Gemini AI, etc. The question is what people feel unfair or feel it's somehow wrong is because it's just one, it's not with consent, but also if it was meant to be a public sharing, like a good percentage of it went into a common public pool of interest, for our well-being, acknowledging that you are harvesting the public data, right? That would be a very different model, right? But they didn't do that, right? They started, remember? That's how they started with OpenAI, and then they quickly pivoted. So I think that's where people are angry about. And I think indigenous approaches to redistributing value is beyond the market because this is not about the market per se. It's about what's fair and what's valuable because what are we going to do? Sue every company, and that means usually it'll be very and they're doing this, right? The ones who are like the Beyoncés of the world can sue them, right? Taylor Swift, etc. But majority of people don't have the stamina, the legal know-how, or even like they know they're like the David and Goliath situation, right? So it's a sort of like a learned helplessness. So I think what we need to really understand is that if you want to reform these systems from a regulatory level, like we need to put pressures from is that we need to think of ways in which we can create common pool interests, revive the commons, and build a sort of solidarity in that, but also revitalize our, our public good, data good by getting companies to give a certain percentage of the profits, for example. So I think and it's not a pipe dream. Like India already started doing that with the gig platforms during COVID, where they said that, okay, a certain percentage of your profit should go into Social Security. So for these gig workers, because the gig workers don't want permanency, so they don't want a regulation that forces them to be, stuck on one platform. They appreciate the flexibility. But what they want is some security, like baseline security. And COVID actually became very it became very visceral, right? Because they were immediately off and they had nothing as an option. So why not borrow these kinds of ideas and expand on them, right?
And this is our final question. You point to the growing influence of the global south in shaping our digital futures. What challenges do you think still stand in the way of this shift? And most importantly, what gives you confidence that these obstacles can be navigated?
I think, for me, one of the fundamental things is that the global south can be their own enemy. And because the global south has changed radically. We are not what we used to be, right? We have more options. We have the people. That's a huge thing. We have the youth. They have come online. We have the data. Data is power. Numbers, it's a numbers game. So we have all that power. The problem is that we don't see ourselves as worth the kind of way in which we should be leveraging on. So governments don't see their own populations in its as productive, as worthy. It's a youth as a potential of creativity and entrepreneurship and innovation, right? They see them still as a burden. What do we do with them, right? They're very top down. It's still got the they've absorbed the sort of colonial approach to their own subjects, right? And I think we have to reform ourselves in a way, the way we manage our own populations, less in paternalistic, condescending ways, and allow the youth to really co-engage, in their own futures. So, my typical experience in a lot of global south countries run by plus 65, 70-year-old men usually, and they love hearing themselves speak. Oh my God, all of them actually would love to talk at the same time, and they definitely are horrible listeners. There's, and I sit on multiple of these boards, and I can confidently say they really are tone deaf, but usually they're extraordinarily smart, and a number of policies are good, but there's such deep arrogance that they cannot possibly learn from those below, because the waste of time. It is cumbersome, it is tedious, but that's what democracy is, right? And so I think for the longest time they function like a welfare state, and they see themselves as a welfare state. They need to see themselves differently. And I think if we can overcome that, imagine how powerful we could be, because we have the people, we have the majority, and we can have a South-South collaboration, and we're not good at working together too. That's the other thing, right? So this whole South-South solidarity, we're changing. I noticed, thanks to Trump, by the way, Trump has been singularly very conducive, shall we say, glue for the South, because you see the BRICS coming together and coming up with these data plans and sharing and building alliances and setting aside the differences, because they're all getting screwed by the US in many ways. So but how do you sustain that? It can't just be like my enemies, so thereby we're friends. It can't be just that. They have to get on board in a more meaningful way.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much. And
thank you so much, Payal.
Of course, and take care, and looking forward to having it out.